Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the opening of the ISUL Doctoral School program. As season opener, we have the chance to have the professor Andy Miah with us from the University of Salford in Manchester, where he has been since 2014 a chair in science communication and future media. For those who don't know the Professor Mia, it works concerns many fields of research such as bioethics, doping in sport, human enhancement, extended realities, emerging technologies, digitalization. But I hope I make no mistake in saying that he is above all a privileged interlocutor to talk about how societies are dealing with new technologies. And precisely one of the areas that interest him at the moment is the development of virtual sport. And I guess especially in this particularly sanitary context. Now I'm gonna stop to talk and pass it on to the Professor Mia. And thanks again to have accepted our invitation.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be contributing again to the UNIL environment. As I was just mentioning at the beginning, Lausanne is a very special place for me, and I often get brought back to talk to students there, and it's always a wonderful experience. And in many respects, kind of the location is has been really formative for me. I was actually a postgraduate student when I attended. I suppose it was part of the Olympic Studies Centre at the Olympic Museum, which had an international funding for students, and I came along and studied there for a couple of months, and that was largely because I was very much beginning a journey in learning about the Olympic Games. I was lucky enough to be chosen to take part in what was, I think it's still, I'm sure it's still running. It's the International Olympic Academy in Greece, which has had a postgraduate program for the last, I think, 30 years, maybe now, maybe not quite that long. I think it was 1990s it started. And so spent 6 weeks learning about Olympic history. And at the time I was working much more in the world of doping and as Ola mentioned, was the sort of performance enhancement side of things. But I think very early on in my career, I was very conscious of the fact that there were two major technological revolutions that were taking place around me. One was the digital revolution, and I was one of those people that at university can sort of remember when the internet sort of was available. You know, there were the kind of really geeky, nerdy people that already sort of had access and modems and were dialing up to connect. And as a new PhD student, I was starting to think about how I would inhabit digital space, and began building websites and trying to build some kind of presence at a time when people really weren't. And actually that was a really informative decision, because I went to the Sydney Olympic Games in 2000 for scientific reasons, really, for conferences that were taking place around the Olympic Games. But then I learned about a venue that's called the Non-Accredited Media Centre, which was a space for uh, journalists that were coming to the Olympics, but who were not reporting on the sport. So at the Olympic Games, you have a population of journalists that are covering all the sports, and that's why they go. And you have another population that cover everything else, from the politics, the logistics, all those sort of issues that break that aren't related to what's happening within the arenas. And they have their own facility that's called the Non-Accredited Media Center. So I rolled up to this media center thinking I could get accreditation to it, and I showed them my website. And at that time, you know, having a website was enough. It showed you were kind of out there publishing materials, and they gave me accreditation, and that then led to really 20 years of research investigating media change around the Olympic Games. So digital was a huge sort of motivator for me to write about and think about. But actually, my PhD was on genetics, and looking particularly at how genetic transfer, or gene transfer at the time as it was called, gene editing now is, I think, how we often refer to it, could be utilized to modify athletic performances. And back in 1999, whilst I was sort of beginning these investigations, the International Olympic Committee, uh, particularly through its medical commission, was very anxious about the possibility of genetically modified athletes. It was probably a year after research had been shown to be able to identify what were described as performance genes. So all of a sudden, and I guess you got to also bear in mind that at this point, the Human Genome Project, this huge international collaboration trying to map the human genome, was beginning to reach its conclusion. So there was lots of conversation and discussion about the possibility of creating a kind of designer people, the future defined less by evolution and more by biotechnology. So everyone in the sports world were incredibly anxious about this because, of course, you will all appreciate one of the biggest anxieties in sports is around doping. And genetics seemed at the time, and I would say still, a sort of way of modifying ourselves that was well beyond the detection capabilities of the elite sports world. So those two journeys for me have always been present in everything that I do, and so I sort of developed an interest in ethics and emerging technologies, which has led me to always sort of find time to think about and analyze and try to understand ultimately the way in which technology is changing our lives and what we might do about that. So that really sort of broadly describes how I find myself in this position, where I now work with two organizations that are really developing very quickly a kind of international community in the sort of wider world of esports, which is the Global Esports Federation and the British Esports Association. And incidentally, I would very much welcome you putting questions in the chat. Can everybody do that? Is that something everyone has the facility to do?
I think so, but
Let's see if I put it on here. So if you have any questions throughout, do feel welcome to interrupt. I find that often sessions like this do go really well when people just add questions into chat, and I can respond to them during the talk. But yeah, so I think probably it was 2013 when I started to talk about esports in the global sort of sports community. In fact, I remember, and this is not terribly well known outside of this meeting, we had the IOC. The IOC has, I was about to explain what the IOC was then, but then, obviously don't need to do that here. The IOC has a press commission, and every sort of couple of years it meets. The former head of media operations, Anthony Edgar, was very proactive in setting up interesting meetings where the attendees of that commission would talk about sort of emerging issues. And in 2013, we had a meeting in, I think it was New York, and I started speaking about esports. And at the time, nobody had any clue what this was. And certainly, as you will appreciate as well, many members of these commissions are not the youngest of people. And so for them, it was a world that was completely unknown to them, and also actually quite troubling. The idea that young people were becoming sort of communities of competitive computer game players was something that I think many people in the world of sports actually didn't like the idea of. And that's partly, I think, because we've seen over 20 years, perhaps, if not more, growing kind of moral panic around the increased use of digital technologies by young people, and the anxiety, particularly from the sports world, but also the wider kind of healthcare environment, that this may in fact be limiting the enjoyment of a full and rich life, particularly enjoying physical activity. So in 2013, which was, I think, the first presentation I gave on this subject to an international community, it was something that really wasn't an interest, or indeed, I guess, something that was at all appealing to be connected to. Now, nearly 8 years now later, we see how much has changed. Just last January, and just before everything went into lockdown at the Youth Olympic Games in Lausanne, the IOC session that took place a couple of days before the games began involved a special session that was led by the president of UCI, so the cycling union, who is the rapporteur for the IOC's special interest group in esports. I think it's called the Esport Liaison Group, which has been established now for a couple of years. And during his presentation, which essentially outlined how rapidly the esports industry is growing, um, but also it was a follow-up communication after having done some research into where the sports federations were in developing their sort of response to esports. And it was apparent that I think the figures were something like 85% of sports federations were interested in working with esports, but only 25% had a strategy to do so, which is quite low considering how much has happened. But the really memorable moment in that session was when Dick Pound, former vice president of IOC, when offering comments on this presentation, said categorically, if the sports federations do not figure out their strategy, then the Olympic movement will be very rapidly taken to the cleaners. So the anxiety is that what's happening in the esports world is in fact sort of writing the obituary for the elite sports sector, which I think is something that many people in elite sports don't quite appreciate yet. But I think even if you're not working in that world, you can sort of appreciate it if you have children, and especially if you have children that are more interested in watching gamers streaming content than watching live television. We know that over the last 10 years, we've moved from a world where television is a static box in a room to now a mobile streaming platform. I certainly haven't looked at a television schedule in years. I remember 20 years ago buying newspapers that would have television schedules in them, and you might circle the things you might want to watch. And now I think those habits are completely lost. And that sort of speaks to the wider changes in our media culture. I often ask my students how many of them have bought a newspaper in the last year, and the last time I did this, which was last year, it was the first time that none of them had. I mean, zero. There's usually there's like 3 or 4 students in a class of 100, but in this lecture, 0 students bought a newspaper. So I think what's happened over this sort of last 5 years is a growing realization that the media environment in which sports are located and economically rely is changing dramatically. And we've seen alongside that a growth of partnerships, of projects, programs, which are trying to find ways of the elite sports world into that space. And what I want to do over the course of this presentation is partly to talk to a number of these things that I think are going on, and what that means for how we think about sports. And certainly I'll talk a lot about what's happened over this sort of COVID period, because I think many of the innovations, so thank you, Alan, for that message. I think many of the things that have happened over the last 12 months, just by chance almost, kind of articulate some of those changing dynamics. And I think some of the questions that you sort of might have in mind is what are the impacts of increasingly digital lives, digital experiences for the cultures of physical activity that exist around us? And we see that in a whole but I think for me, what always draws me into a subject to think about is the innovation culture around it. So what you're seeing in the background at the moment is the live stream of the League of Legends World Finals opening ceremony. So League of Legends, if you haven't heard of it, is a computer game, an esports title that is very much located within the fantasy realm, a 5 versus 5 competition. And over the last 3 years, this community has grown enormously, and the world final tournaments are always a huge sort of subject of investment and production. And so in this particular scene, you see augmented reality performers dancing alongside physical dancers within the stadium. So if you're watching this as a spectator, you see this kind of mixed reality going on in front of you. And so many of the people working within the esports world are kind of pioneering new ways of staging events. And I've always been amazed by going to the Olympic Games. I go every 2 years as part of my research. And of course, a big part of the elite sports world is the staging, the production, the kind of production values of creating a mega event are at the heart of of what gives it its sort of social currency. And that operates across so many different levels, from the performances being sort of groundbreaking, record-breaking performances, but also the amount of technology that goes into the production around it. So elite sports have become synonymous not just with kind of elite human achievements that are transcending human limits, but also examples of where technologically we push the boundaries of audience experience. So the League of Legends opening ceremony, along with the production itself, were among the best sort of spectacles that I've seen within any sort of mega event context. I think many people regard this to be really pushing the frontiers of event staging and production. So thank you, Josephine. How do you think the IS could catch up the delay they have regarding esports? Especially IF boards are still mainly ruled by traditions, often conservative members who defend their sport in the form they have known forever. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think this is a major wake-up call for them. It's really challenging. I think I remember I was asked to give a talk for FINA, the Swimming Federation, in 2018. So they brought me over to Canada to give a talk, and they were just starting up their own sort of mobile application. You know, this is 15 years after mobile apps have been launched, and it just feels like even the sort of relatively wealthy federations haven't got the resources to actually find a way into this. I think that some of the examples that I'll talk about over the course of our session will give some insight into, I think, some of those opportunities. But I think one of the key things that I say to federations is that the esports world isn't just a singular thing. There's not just one way in which you can occupy that space, and trying to find the different entry points into it is a really important part of it. And to give you one example of that, here we have behind me, this is the staging of an event that took place in Fortnite last July. You may have read about it in the press. You can see the countdown clock. Whoops, so it is right there. So this is the premiere, or essentially the first gig, from an artist called Travis Scott, who was producing a performance within this space. And what's really interesting about it for me, sort of historically, culturally, is that we have a music industry now occupying a computer gaming space to sell their product. And it's that fusion of industries that is a big part of the opportunity that I think sports federations need to understand. So you can see here the Travis Scott character is about to begin the performance, and you see now in real time how this is happening. So if you wanted to watch Travis Scott last year, you couldn't go to any concerts, they weren't happening, but you could download Fortnite and watch the premiere of this track. So the esports industry isn't just one thing. I think the sport to realize that what's happening in digital technology at the moment is the integration of a range of sort of cultural sector actors that are creating a really sort of multi-layered experience. You see that also on social media. So if you think about the application TikTok, have people heard of TikTok? I bet less of you have used TikTok and actually tried doing anything in it. But TikTok's a great example of a world where you have the economic underpinning of it is intimately related to the music industry. So a lot of what becomes then a popular song can often begin its life in within the application. And a lot of that is what's happening around these social and digital platforms, where the integration of, so it's less about sports just doing their thing and more about how they can interface with a range of other channels. You might not have heard about this, but last year, when the Tokyo Olympics was postponed, we saw the IOC pivot into new partnerships with Airbnb. And if you logged into the Airbnb channel or platform, you could purchase access to Olympic content. You could do things like book to do a workout with an Olympian, or you could access sort of experiences that were about Japanese culture. And again, I think it's really interesting to look at how those major technology providers around the Olympic movement have really changed over the last few years to amplify and extend that digital experience. And it's partly because of that you have to sort of think quite fluidly about what the future of sport could become. So in this virtual reality or mixed reality experience, you're wearing a VR headset that allows you then to compete with each other in a physical space, but with a sort of digital mediation going on as well. And I think in many respects, the international federations, one of the things they need to realize is that their sports cannot remain fixed in time. They have to also think about evolving their sports around technology. And I think that's one of the ways in which they can become um, viable in a world where increasingly these technological interfaces have shown the possibility of flourishing. So it's difficult, I think, for traditionalists. But again, I go back to the Youth Olympic Games, and you'll be aware that the Youth Olympic Games has kind of modified sporting content. So if you go to the Summer Games, they have basketball, there's a three-on-three basketball, or they have a slam dunk competition. So basketball has modified its proposition around kind of innovation and the changing cultures of basketball communities. The fact that more people are playing kind of street pickup games than going to basketball courts. And I think that's the sort of message that we see that these sports federations really need to understand in order to be fit for purpose. And it's not kind of surprising. You know, if you look back to the ancient Olympic Games, you know, there were sports that are similar to what we see today, but they weren't the same. Sport has and should always evolve. And I think that it's often, I think because people get attached to what they did as a child or what they've done as a career, and they feel very attached to sort of the parameters of those experiences. But in fact, I think that's mistaken. I think that part of your responsibility to your sport is to encourage it to evolve beyond your own experience, and that means certainly transforming what your sport feels like, what it looks like, what it does technologically. All these things are in fact, I think, part and parcel of the sports world. And to think about sports as a kind of innovation community is, I think, a healthy way to explore that future, which is evidenced by this experience here, which is Zwift. You may have heard about Zwift, a computer game cycling environment where you can sit at home, compete from your living room or your gym or your club, and your avatar is then pushed out into this world and experienced in a way that allows you to see what each one is doing, whether or not they are in the same place. And what's happened over the last 18 months is that Zwift has shown the possibilities of creating essentially distributed competition experiences within a communal digital space. And it makes a lot of sense, because as much as the sports world likes to talk about sustainability and environmental concern, we know that one of the biggest impacts that the sports world has is in the travel required of athletes to actually get to competitions. I remember being on a flight with an Olympic athlete a few years ago, and he told me that he's traveling 200 days of the year. And I think there's only so far you can commit to sort of the principles of concerns about the climate emergency whilst maintaining a life where you're traveling quite so much. So I think that there are lots of things that the sports world have to really grapple with to find alternative ways in which we can produce encounters with human excellence. And I think that is at the heart of, I think, what elite sports are trying to do. It's to reveal to us examples of human excellence in physical activity. But you can also see from the perspective of the event staging organizations that producing a physical road race like this is incredibly expensive, it's incredibly complicated, and there's only so much of it that you can do. But in this case, you could create virtual races nearly all the time, or at the very least, you could bring the cyclists into an arena, sit them on a bicycle where they are competing physically, but where they're actually articulating their achievements within a digital space. And it was actually Thomas Bach at the IOC session last year who said that, in fact, things like this are not simulating sport, they are sport. So I think we're beginning to see an awakening from the world of sport to realizing that there is actually a need to really rethink their proposition. And of course, a lot of this has happened over the year where nothing could take place, where we were stuck at home, where events couldn't open, where venues were locked down and had no ability to actually produce activities. And I think that's been a real catalyst for the sort of imaginations of the people who work within this sector. I think sadly there's a lot of short-termism in this, so they're sort of thinking about switching back into the old normal. But examples like this, which I watched this broadcast on YouTube, and I must admit, when seeing this to me looks like film. It looks like film quality, but actually it's a computer-generated race. So in March 2020, the Australian Grand Prix was cancelled, and instead they set up an online event where drivers who were due to compete in the physical race competed alongside the best gamers in the world, and they had their own sort of competition within this computer game environment. Uh, the production of the event is so similar to the physical race that they're indistinguishable, I think, for many people. And these sorts of experiments really showed the possibilities to make additional experiences out of these computer game versions. I think for many sports federations, one of their major limitations is actually their sporting calendar. Even if you're a very successful sport, like athletics, there are only so many events that you have that attract major sort of investments into your community. The majority of activities don't attract any investments at all. So if you can find ways to harness new income streams through using digital gaming experiences, then that might be a more effective way to actually make your organization financially sustainable, but also technologically viable for a generation that is increasingly happy to sort of sit within a computer generated world and experience sport in that way. And I think it's important to emphasize again how embryonic these things are, how early they are. This is a stream from Twitch, the Amazon owned esports gaming channel that allows people to stream their gaming content. And what you're seeing here is in fact the first esports competition from an Olympic Games. It took place in Rio 2016. It was set up by a man called Chester King, who's now the CEO of British Esports Association. And they created an international competition, not part of the Olympic program, but certainly an example of how you can bring esports into that Olympic world. And you will have seen many discussions about whether that's something that we can expect to see. Could esports become part of the Olympic program? It's a really interesting conversation because I think many people are already quite frustrated with it. And so I hear lots of people in the Olympic world who really don't want to talk about this. It's such a controversial subject that in fact it's not really going very far. But I predict that we will see a lot more traction on this in the next 4 to 8 years. We already had 2 years ago the president of Paris 2024 who wanted to bring esports into the Paris 2024 program. That's not happened. I think we'll still see some sort of example of esports competition take place within it, but I think there's more likely an expectation that with LA 2028 we'll see some esports activity, maybe even part of the program. Thank you, Josephine. How can esports world champs such as UCI in 2020 still ensure a fair and safe sport? Yeah, this is a really controversial subject. Many people who are into platforms like Zwift have mixed feelings about the sort of ethics of this as a competition. I think the view is generally that if it's taking place sort of over the internet, distributed, then there are some major sort of integrity questions around it as to whether the competition is fair, which is why esports, in fact, it's really interesting. There's a company called Overactive Media, which is based in Canada, set up by Chris Overalt, who was the former president of the Canadian Olympic Committee. And in the last week, they have launched the sort of early plans to set up an esports arena in Toronto. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. But one of the things that they have noticed is that um, whilst many people think that these esports events, because they're played over computers, they don't need physical venues. In fact, the contrary is the case. What's happening is that, as I mentioned with the League of Legends, the the kind of production of a physical arena-based experience is pushing the boundaries of live experiences, and people come to them because they expect to see something really remarkable and extraordinary. And so the esports industry is now beginning to really have an impact on the sort of staging of events in live venues around the world, where we see many companies starting to think about, you know, what the arena can look like for the 21st century. I think this is, again, what always excites me about the subject is there are so many people around it that are pushing the boundaries of creativity, of innovation. So there are major organizations that are trying to think about, how do we build a stadium for the 21st century? I think the sort of 20th century stadium was pretty static as a design proposition. There may have been some limited innovations, but it's been mostly, you know, people sitting in chairs watching something. And I think what's happening at the moment with esports is the desire to rethink that interaction. And I think it's partly out of what we've seen take place in sort of audience expectations over the sort of era of social media. I remember probably around 2013, 2014, many people in the world of of sports broadcasting and sports production were very anxious about the possibility of social media are actually undermining the television audiences that underpin elite sports. Um, and and what happened evidently is that, in fact, people that typically used a lot of social media would also typically watch a lot of sports content. So there wasn't a reduction there, but there was certainly a blending. And you may be sort of familiar yourself with this experience where you're watching television, it's in your living room, but you're also watching your mobile phone at the same time. Now, if you're the owner of that event that you're supposed to be watching, it's a really sort of, it really focuses the mind to realize that maybe 50% of the time your audience isn't even looking at the content. And so how do you design experiences that try to increase the amount of time that people spend looking at the content? These have been really sort of live conversations about how to stage events in a world where people have many different distractions and things that are trying to grab their attention. And in fact, you might not have noticed this, because, you know, why would you? It's something incredibly obscure, but historically, the IOC has often talked about the impact of the Olympic Games in terms of television hours. But as of Rio 2016, they talk about live streamed hours. And I think, again, it speaks to the fact that those online audiences are becoming far bigger. I think it was 2008 for the Beijing Olympic Games, when the IOC worked with Google to produce games content across 78 territories through YouTube. This was the sort of first time they did a major sort of investment to bring games content into places where there was no kind of television infrastructure or proposition to acquire the rights to the Olympics. And so YouTube was used as a place to locate that content. So this is all, I think, intimately connected to that journey towards esports, and why we find ourselves in this world where the prospects of virtual sport are becoming all the more real. And they're also all the more real as a result of that technological transformation that we're seeing around us. So things like this, which hopefully you can see it, maybe sort of if I hold it here. So this VR headset, which was, I mean, this is an Oculus Quest first version. Let me just take this off. So this is the first version of the Oculus Quest. And I think it cost us about 600, maybe 700 UK pounds, so euros. And now they're about 300 pounds for the second version. But the thing that was really innovative about these, and there have of course been lots of VR headsets over the last 7 or 8 years, but the really big innovation is what you see on the front with these cameras that track the space in front of you. And in 2013 or 14, if you wanted to use virtual reality in a way that allowed you to map out the physical space in a room, you'd have to do something far more sophisticated. It would cost a lot of money to do it. Technologically, it'd be difficult to set up. And now this is all built into a headset that costs comparatively very little. So the ease of technological access to creating increasingly immersive experiences is really having a big impact on the prospects of esports becoming part of that world. And it has to do with the fact that the easiest way for the sports world to find its way into esports is through that connection with physical activity. So if you have ever used virtual reality to take part in a kind of physically active experience, you'll know that it's incredibly tiring. It's you sweat a lot. I've got a friend that works at the BBC who did 30 days in virtual reality trying to build his own level of fitness and playing the game uh, Beat Saber. Have anyone heard of Beat Saber? It's a music game where you have to essentially kind of smash things with sticks as they come towards you. If you play Beat Saber for 3 minutes, you're sweating quite a lot. And so it works on coordination, it works on cardiovascular, and there are increasing numbers of activities that are like this within those VR experiences. And again, I will sort of remind you again that one of the key things that we talk about in this one is just how new it is. So people often say, well, it's still quite difficult to wear a VR headset. That's not really something that lots of people are going to do for very long. And yes, it's quite true. I think that I think that being within a VR experience for more than 15, 20 minutes can feel quite tiring and can be quite disorientating. But again, these are really early days. The design processes are changing rapidly. You might have seen a few years ago the launch of a platform called Microsoft HoloLens, which is a big kind of headset, quite heavy really, but has a transparent visor on the front of it that displays digital content. And these are the sorts of things that are changing really rapidly. The HoloLens now is a reduced version. It's much lighter, much smaller, but has the same sort of functionality within it. And we see also examples like Google Glasses from 3 years ago, no, 5 years ago now, beginning to sort of see how you can experiment with new interfaces. And I think that's one of the things that really for me sort of signals how much is changing. It's not just one thing, it's a whole range of innovations that are happening around the world of elite sports, and they're slowly sort of getting into it. I think that we see, for example, with Rio 2016, they broadcast around 60 hours of content in virtual reality. I think we'll see a lot more of that sort of experience happening. If you look at, and I spend some of my time looking through these things. One study I did recently was a patent history of drone technology, and whilst doing that research, I discovered that that there's I think it's Sony that has a patent award for a virtual reality spectator system for an esports environment. So at the moment, if you're watching esports, you'll be watching it on a flat screen typically. What they want to create is the possibility that you put your headset on and you find yourself within the virtual reality world, but also able therefore to move around. And I think that's another thing that I'm always very conscious of, the fact that most people haven't tried any of this stuff, and it's so important to kind of try it out in order to know why it's so compelling. And I remember probably a couple of years ago now, one of the big sort of concerns about virtual reality was that it was still quite static. So you kind of stood and you turned around and you had the headset on. Whereas now with the headset that I've just shown you, it maps out the physical space of a room or an environment, and you walk around that physical space within the virtual world. So we have these really mixed reality experiences going on, which is bringing back that aspect of the physical world that I think is so central to what sports need to see in order to embrace those sorts of technologies. And part of, I think, what they need to be doing, and I think we're beginning to see this, I hear more sports federations starting to find themselves part of this community, is they're starting to experiment a bit more with these sorts of experiences. I think in some respects, one of the good ways to sort of think about these prospects is around the sort of amateur experience. and think about what the amateurs will do in order to take part within this world. And I want to, if I can, show you more of these things whilst showing you something that I want to share from my screen. So let me just see if I can do that. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen with you. And walk you through some of these things as I go through them. Because for me, a lot of the sort of arguments that I make really talk about the. Can you see that? Can everyone see the screen, the video, the slides? Great. A lot of what I talk about is how all these principles are showing us a future for sports where these forms of interaction are integrated within the experience. And I think that's increasingly likely because we see how the technological facilities around esports are also part of that world. It's not, we're increasingly reliant on and interested in integrating those technologies into our lives. If you think about the proliferation of mobile tracking applications, devices like Garmin and Apple Watches that are all about trying to fuse together those worlds of physical activity and digital participation, I think we see those principles coming into play. And it's always, I think, really useful to think about what the long-term impacts of those changes is. I think that in many respects, it's critical that I would say that the foundation of the elite sports industry is intimately connected to the behavioral habits of its consumers. And if those consumers expect more interaction from the experiences they choose, then we need to find ways to modify them. Thanks for your message, Pim. I'm just going to read it out. The esports world you describe seems contrary to the current Olympic Games model. It is so conservative. Do you believe they actually are compatible, that the Olympic governing bodies will manage to conduct the transition you call for? Well, it's an interesting question because as I mentioned earlier, I have started working with the Global Esports Federation, which was launched in 2019. To much sort of controversy, I would say, particularly for people within the esports world, because there's already quite a sophisticated esports industry out there with many people doing really great things. And so the need for a new industry, a new federation that will try to or profess to bring together lots of other stakeholders is always controversial. I mean, you know, there's no way in which the launch of global esports would have been, you know, a quiet affair. But what's interesting about it is that it's run by many former IOC executives, and many of the people that are on its commissions are people that have worked within that world for many, many years. So Paul Foster, who's the COO of Global Esports, has been involved with the Olympic Committee for 20 years now, started off in Sydney. So here another person, Charmaine Crooks, incredible ambassador for the Olympic movement, you know, Olympian, medalist, businesswoman, entrepreneur, really sort of, I would say quite, you know, go-getting community of people, really people that are pushing the boundaries of sports, but have always tried to sort of innovate with what they do. And that sort of broadly describes the population of people that are involved with this organization. So, and at the heart of many of our conversations, as you can probably imagine, in the sort of board and committee meetings that we have, it often sort of comes up as to what our purpose is. You know, what is the role of a global esports federation? And I think a big part of our role is actually as a sort of intermediary between that world of esports and the sports world. There's a huge amount of translation that's needed to help people understand what the esports world is all about, but also, and particularly, to find a way for them to connect with it in some useful partnership. So I think it's a slow process, But again, Pim, the meeting that took place last year, the IOC session, where Dick Pound is telling everyone to get their act together. I mean, these things are powerful, as is the moment when Thomas Bach tells the journalists that Swift is in fact a sport. I don't know. What's your impression of this? Do you think they're incompatible?
Well, thanks for the question. Well, it's the description that you gave of all the esports events. And for me, it looks the contrary to the Olympic Games. Like, as you said, they have not evolved so much over the last 100 years. So that's why I was so shocked by this, the contrary, of both worlds. And I was wondering if it was actually compatible.
Yeah. I wonder, Josephine, if you would sort of chip in on this, because I think your question sort of speaks to that as well. Do you think the federations are able to get involved effectively with esports?
I think they think they do, but they're doing it the wrong way, and they are complacent. I just give an example. I saw, for example, that the UCI hired what they call an innovation manager. But if you look actually at what his function is, it's, first of all, it's a former cyclist. So he's more into the traditional way of cycling. And then esport is somehow mentioned in it, but it's basically all around the in-race experience, but in-race is still the traditional way of doing the sport. So the title itself is misleading, but I'm pretty sure they believe they are doing the right thing. So, and that's why they stopped first then. So, yeah, I think it's still a lack of realization of where it could go, and I do understand that it's difficult to catch and to grasp, because it's about rules and regulations, and how, as I wrote, I think somebody managed to kind of win a race by using a kitchen machine. Like I think it was a salad. Because and instead of a bike, and so then you go like, okay, if you can do that, how can you ensure that that is still a fair competition?
Yeah.
And all these questions are just they are so difficult to grasp for them at the moment, that I don't think they know where to start with it, and then it just
I think you're right. And actually I know there is a lot of work thinking about this. So for example, there's the Esports Integrity Commission, which is an international organization that's trying to work through some of these. In fact, I almost forgot this. One of my remits at Global Esports is to work with the ITU, the ITU, the telecommunications agency that works with the United Nations. So we have a program of work that's just beginning to work with members of the ITU to establish sort of best practice principles for the governance of esports, and to ensure that some of these things are actually understood and addressed. And I think what's, again, for me, always interesting about it is that these are incredibly difficult technological challenges to resolve. To make sort of esports virtually have integrity is a really big technological challenge. And so one of the reasons why I'm sort of drawn to that world is because they're actually wrestling with some of the biggest technological challenges we face as a society. And to give you one sort of quick example of that, back in 2019, well, you'll be familiar with the Turing test, yeah, the test that professes to identify whether in fact computers have the same degree of intelligence as humans. And the sort of standard or standard imitation game, as it was called in Alan Turing's paper from 1953, invited a person to have a conversation with a computer via textual interactions and tried to determine whether they were talking to a human or a computer. I think in the classic sense, they had to determine whether they were talking to a man or a woman. But essentially, the point that the proposition that Turing had was, if we can't tell whether we're talking to a computer or a human, then we may conclude that the computer has the same degree of intelligence as a human. And for many years, sort of scientists have sort of tried to challenge the best computer game programs to ascertain whether they have sort of human intelligence. And classically, this has involved getting people to play games with computers. So you'll remember perhaps from 1997, where the grandmaster, chess master Garry Kasparov competed against IBM's Deep Blue machine in a really sort of famous competition in which, for the first time, the computer won. And it was a moment where it was seen as sort of computer intelligence taking over human intelligence. Well, back in 2015, another competition took place. The next big challenge for the computer was to play the world's champion in the ancient game of Go, which is considered to be a more complicated challenge and a more difficult game to play, which I can confess, having tried playing Go and struggling immensely, it's incredibly complicated. So again, 2015, Google's AlphaGo program played against the world master of Go, and again, the computer won. Well, in December 2019, the next stage of this challenge was around a different kind of game, and it was the esports title StarCraft. So Google's AlphaStar computer program played the world's best StarCraft player, and again, the computer won. And so I think esports and the technology that goes into those game design principles are often pushing the boundaries of what we think of as sort of technological capabilities, which is also why we certainly find in the UK a lot of the university students that play esports are often very much immersed within the STEM subjects. So we are working in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, all really trying to challenge and push the boundaries of technological capabilities. And it's that innovation community that I think is really part of that world. Just reading back, Orlan, sorry for this outsiders questions. Are most of esports competitions articulated with real physical performances, or some of them are still run by players who are sitting? Well, no, it's a great question, because in actual fact, the majority of esports are people sitting down at keyboards and consoles and controllers playing computer games. So again, as you can imagine, that most people in the sports world look at that and think, well, this is awful. This is not sport at all. It's not active. It's not. And the response to that is often, well, that's the same with Formula One racing. You're kind of sitting there, not really doing very much. Or even if you're in Olympic shooting, there's not much gross motor action taking place there. So it seems like on the face of it, a relatively sedentary activity. But what we know is that to be a good esports player, you have to be really physically fit. You have to be someone that trains hard, that is, that eats well, that rests. So many of the virtues that build the best esports player are similar to the sorts of virtues that we see around esports as well, around traditional sports as well. So I think that, and that's, I would say, Olan, we're moving into this world where we're seeing a lot more conversation about what are called active esports. So the sorts of things that I've talked about a little bit that show the possibility of I guess bringing people into a world where they're actually a bit more kind of connected into it. So to give you sort of some examples of this, I'm going to mute this, but hopefully you can see it. So this is in fact, let's just watch the video. Can you tell me if you can hear the video? No? Okay. The sound isn't really important. This is a prototype from 2015, which is a augmented reality headset where if you go out snowboarding or skiing, you can use your headset to augment that experience. And of course, it has sort of social integrations within the headset as well. And I guess most of you will ski, and maybe some of you have tried out sort of the augmented displays within headsets that allow you to sort of see the ski runs and make your choices as to where you go. But this is 2015. So these sorts of technologies are becoming a bigger part of that innovation world, which connects that sort of high-end technology with a whole range of innovations that are available to the consumer. And I think that connection is a big part of that too. I'm going to show you a couple more things. So this is another great example from 2018, I think it was. So this is a young designer in in Denmark who created an augmented reality table tennis table. And again, I sort of think that it's easy to be sort of, I guess, less complimentary than one might be in relation to these things. But again, they're so, these are people pushing the boundaries of innovation. They're early prototypes that are trying out new technologies, new techniques, and exploring the possibilities. And in this case, you can see projection mapping being used on a table tennis table to create an interface that allows you to then think about your interaction with this sport in a very different way. And I think, again, for traditionalists who might think, well, just, pick up a bat and play table tennis, you don't need this technology. But again, I think it's partly for the fact that young people today are increasingly have increasingly high expectations of interactivity, that these, and indeed the integration of digital interfaces within those experiences, that we see the possibilities that these in fact may enrich the player experience. Because it's also complete nonsense to say that sports are perfect. They're not. They also evolve. We know that the rules of sports evolve. We know that the communities of participants change over time. We know that the technologies they use to perform change as well. So you might see this as simply the next iteration of table tennis. Things like this tracking technology, allowing people to see more of the data that's taking place within the performance, building visualizations that make it televisually more interesting for people to watch, or even engaging for athletes to compete in, are providing new ways of thinking about what that sport could be. I remember I saw, actually, I think it was just a couple of months ago, and I'd be curious to know whether you see this actually over in Switzerland yet, but snow volleyball is becoming a big thing. Are you seeing this? Have you seen this? I mean, I saw, obviously, beach volleyball was a big innovation for the Olympic Games back in 2004, I think it was. But obviously volleyball beach volleyball is sort of limited seasonally to sun and sand. And so now what's becoming, I think it was the president of Paris 2024 that did some promo work around snow volleyball. So people playing volleyball on snow. And so, these sports are all having to adapt and evolve into new markets to grow their audiences, grow their participation. And I think some of these technologies are a way for them to do that. And it's probably a good way to start to think about this new phenomenon. So less about just what sports look like now, and more about what sports can look like in the future. So sports activities like this VR experience, which looks a bit like the movie Tron, sort of resembles tennis to some extent, and the physical activity required of it can be quite demanding. Although, again, this was a prototype promo video, so a huge amount has changed already with regards to this sort of interactivity in just the last couple of years. So these are all experiments, and I think that's a really important thing to get across, that what we're seeing today is a huge amount of experimentation with new formats of interactive technologies. And I think the awareness of why this is becoming so compelling is that we see more and more people wanting to experience the world in that way. You may remember the phenomenon of Pokemon Go from 2016, this mobile application that allowed people to use augmented reality to discover characters from the Pokemon world, and which spawned a whole number of articles written by academics about how this application encouraged young people to become more physically active. They'd go out and find these Pokemon that are located in specific physical GPS sites. So if you wanted to collect a specific Pokemon, you couldn't just do it by sitting down. You had to go out and find it. And some of those principles, I think, are becoming even more apparent within this wider world of esports that we're talking about. I want to go through a few more of the comments. I think PS, I think we have, I think the Olympic governing bodies will manage to conduct the transition that I talk about. I think it's sort of stepping stones, Pim. I think that it's not clear that we see how that transition will happen comfortably for many of them. Thomas Bach has talked about the anxieties the Olympic sports world have about sort of games where there's the depiction of violence. So I think there's a clear sort of red line that's been drawn around those titles. But then it also is, I think, uncomfortable for the sports world, because its history is located within sort of a kind of violent context of sort of military sports, and some of those military sports still are present within that Olympic world. So I think it's a difficult situation for them to be in. It comes down, of course, to the Olympic Games being comfortable, the Olympic Committee being comfortable with broadcasting events where there is a kind of glorification of violence, and many of those sort of games that depict war zones or those sorts of activities often also kind of not sensationalize, but fictionalize the act of violence, if you like, in a way. So another question from Pim: since you worked in anti-doping, do you feel that sport participant teams have different vision on the necessity of anti-doping? So there's a lot of work that's been looking at the presence of anti-doping, of doping within esports. The Esports Integrity Commission has been trying to understand more about this world. My feeling is at this stage, we still don't fully understand what's going on. I think that in any competitive professional setting, you have to assume that attempts to enhance performance outside of the rules of that activity are taking place. For many years, I think the sports world didn't really understand what was going on. And then we had the World Anti-Doping Agency that came along and started to make more inroads into understanding what was going on, which was a sea change in understanding the culture of enhancement. I think we haven't really got that yet with esports. It's still something that people are trying to come to terms with. And yet what we do know is there are lots of sort of anxieties about the behaviors of people within this community, the sort of intensity of competition that could affect sort of mental well-being. We see players burn out by the age of 22. It's often a very young population of competitors. I saw just yesterday in the BBC News, there's a young, I think it's a Fortnite player who's 8 years old, who's hoping to become world champion. And so you think, well, how comfortable are we with that? But then we also have people like Sky Brown, a skateboarder who's hoping to go to the Olympics this year at the age of 11, I think she is. So I think there are sort of common aspects of sort of concern about welfare that go beyond just anti-doping and that speak more to kind of the wider health and well-being of the people within this community. So I think those are sort of really live issues to try to understand and figure out, but it still feels like quite early on in that process. Josephine, which IFs are the forerunners in integrating esports, and what are the key factors, triggers that allow them to be forerunners? I would say not many at this stage, in all honesty, Josephine. I think that there are organizations like UCI that have obviously a common ground with an activity that, incidentally, people within the world of esports don't really think of Zwift as an esport. They talk about it as an active esport, but it's not really something that they see as part of their world. I know that Chester King, who I mentioned earlier, who leads the British Esports Association, he has been for quite some time quite comfortable with the idea that esports are not treated as sports, or in fact treated as games and sort of legally categorized in that way, because he's concerned that if young people consider that their participation in esports kind of ticks the box of sports participation, then they may actually cease to choose other forms of physical activity. And of course, that's relevant on a much wider scale than just those individual children. It's about the way in which the industries are supported financially and given sort of legal recognition. So I think that one of the things that was said at the IOC session last year was, I'm not sure if it was Thomas Back that said this, but one of the IOC members made the argument that what the sports world can bring to all esports, whether they are sport-related titles like Zwift or NBA 2K, the basketball game, so whether or not the content is sports-related, the sports world can still bring knowledge and insights to that community about a kind of active living and the importance of finding ways to combine your training as an esports player with living a healthy lifestyle and living a sort of active lifestyle as well. So I think those are probably the ways in which we see federations get involved. But, I'm also conscious of the fact that The Global Esports Federation has built partnerships with, I think, at least 20 sports federations now. So they've become members, and I think that's with a view to building programs of work around them. Some of them are really obvious, like FIFA. FIFA is an exceptional example where for many years now, the kind of computer game version of the sport is now intimately connected to the physical version, to the point where you have sports clubs, football clubs, signing esports players as part of their kind of team. And we know also that a lot of the sort of data that goes into the simulations that are found within the FIFA computer game are also informing some of the real world decisions that are happening in the world of soccer. So there's a really, but it's, again, like Zwift, it's an exceptional example. It's something that there aren't many really good esports titles that relate specifically to kind of sports content. Most of them are like League of Legends or StarCraft or Fortnite, where they're dealing with, the content, the landscape, visual landscape has nothing much to do with sports, at least on face value. But again, it's not inconceivable to me that we can see how those worlds become more intimately connected. And one of the ways that I think we will see that is through amateur participation. So if you think about your gymnasium, where if you go to a gym today, you will see quite likely a lot of technology present within that space, but probably you haven't seen much yet integration of gaming experiences. You will see platforms that have sort of data visualizations of your activity that allow you to see how you're progressing, but most of these aren't really competitive or social. You might have treadmills that have television screens in front of them so you can watch TV whilst you're running. But I think we'll see a lot of these esports habits nurtured through next generation gym technology, which will essentially transform the exercise space into a gamified competitive space. So if you wanted to watch the London Marathon, but you're also a runner, you might decide to jump on the treadmill and run it alongside the athletes as they're taking part in it. So I think those are sort of examples of where we see that sort of desire to emerge. And what I want to show you is an example of that is in this platform called Zombies Run, which is a mobile fitness application where you download the app, you press play, and you find yourself as a character in a zombies movie. And essentially you have to run, and you have to run away from the zombies, which of course means you get your physical activity. But the point is here that you're fusing the storytelling world of fiction and creative filmmaking with the physical activity experience. And for me, I always sort of like to talk about this as an example of an esport, because it sort of reflects the way in which esports are breaking down the categories that we've sort of set up historically, but which actually don't do us much good. There are many people in this world that never go to a gym and would never think about going to a gym. But if you tell them the gym is a place where they can play computer games, then that might change. In fact, one of the programs we're beginning to develop in British esports is working with leisure centers, sports centers, to create esports facilities and use these as a way to sort of lure children who aren't physically active into the environment. So it might be that you're able to take part in a virtual reality active experience, or it might be that you do some work in the gym and then you get credits to use it within the esports facility. But the point is that I think the people in the world of sport love to believe that everything is open and everyone universally loves playing sports, but we know that that's just not the case. And in fact, many people turn away from sports and physical activity very early on in life. Today is, you may have seen, today is World Obesity Day. So many organizations, WHO and so on, are sort of pushing content about obesity. And it's clear that innovative solutions are needed to get people being more physically active and leading healthier lifestyles. Experiences like this is called Les Mills The Trip. And what you're seeing here is the graphic visualization of the participants within a spinning class. So you walk into this space, which is a kind of 3-walled virtual reality cave, and you get on your bicycle and you find yourself within this virtual space, cycling through this environment. And these are all ways in which you sort of transform the physical activity that people do to encourage them to be more physically active and engage with things quite differently. Let me have a quick look at any other questions. So I think, yeah, so Josephine, I don't think there are many front runners. In fact, there are very few at this stage. And as I mentioned with that report from the IOC last year, whilst many of the sports federations are anxious about this, most of them haven't done very much about it. And I think that's what the IOC is particularly concerned about is if, my son is 10 years old and, quite frankly, he doesn't watch television. He watches gaming content that's being streamed on platforms, or he's playing games himself. So for him, it's not just what he's doing now, it's also the habits that he will have formed by the time he's at an age where he may pay to see stuff. I could quite believe that by the time he's at an age where he's willing to pay for going to see an event, he will more likely be watching live events that are sort of esports events rather than traditional sports events. And it might be in places like this. This is a visualization from the architecture firm Populous, the major company that's built so many iconic stadia around the world over the last 20 years. And this is their visualization of the esports village, a dramatically different proposition for how we kind of interact with the physical world through digital screens and interfaces that create something that's, even more compelling than the kind of bricks and mortar of buildings that we see around us. And I think many people in this world see that as a major opportunity. Mostly, if you see any sort of building, it's a kind of inanimate experience, that it's essentially, walls, concrete, and not terribly immersive. Whereas this is like a theme park. It's kind of odd. If you go to the Olympic Games or even any sort of major sports event, you think it would be like a theme park, but actually it's most of the spaces are enclosed and there's not much happening around them often. Whereas this visualization for the future of esports architecture design just reveals to us that what's happening is a transformation to that relationship between the athlete and the spectator. And I think one of the things that I think we've realized over the last year with the lockdown is that the live spectators are really relevant to the production of sports. And so trying to ensure that when my son is 30 years old, that he still feels that an arena is a place that is worth going to requires these sorts of integrations of a whole range of other sort of compelling artifacts that make this a really spectacular experience that is, really, really extraordinary to see. These are the sorts of innovations that are happening because of the esports industry. They're not happening because of the sports industry. And I think that's where, when you see all those, I think that one of the ways to make sense of elite sports today is as a creative and innovative community. So the staging of events is entirely predicated on that community who make it something extraordinary. And this is what they're focusing on. So all those organizations, all those skill sets that are working towards staging mega events are looking to esports for inspiration about how to do this differently, how to transform it into a really completely different experience. Thank you, Bertrand. To what extent do you think esports organizations should be tied to official sports federations? That's a great question. And I think my short answer is, in fact, that the sports world is on the back foot here. They're actually not really needed by that world of. So yeah, let's put this onto the background. They're not needed by the world of esports. One of the I think to some extent what the Olympics enjoys, or what elite sports enjoys, is this kind of elite brand and identity and value that underpins that these are the best in the world competing at things. But actually most people in esports don't feel like they need the sports world at all. So there's a lot of work to be done from the sports side of it to actually show that there's something relevant they can contribute. I think in actual fact that the rise of Zwift has been completely inconsequential in terms of the kind of the UCI and the federations. So they have the risk they have of failing to engage has to do with the loss of opportunity and loss of relevance. So where and I sort of say this a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's, I think, potentially really a reminder as to how important it is. What's happening is that I think if the modern Olympic Games was the kind of exemplar of how to create a sort of worldwide brand around audience experiences, then esports is showing what the 21st century version of that can become. And I think the risks are huge for the sports world, which is why, to go back to what I was saying earlier, the realization that young people aren't consuming television is the biggest sort of reminder as to why sports need to be in this space. The risk they face is that 20 years from now, televisual content on its own won't be enough. It won't be compelling enough. We know already that the television audiences of the Olympic Games are quite high. You know, we're looking at 45 to 55 as an age range in the majority. So it's a major loss of audience unless they find ways to integrate these sorts of things into that world. The problem that sports federations will have is that the esports publishers, the people that develop the games, they have no obvious incentive to actually work with a sports federation. I mean, let's face it, sports federations aren't the most agile of organizations. They are, you know, incredibly cumbersome. They're incredibly outdated, many of them. And financially, they're in a slightly precarious place, really, because they don't actually own very much at all. And especially when it comes back down to a sort of esports title, one of the big challenges that integration into the Olympic program involves is that you know, they don't own the field of play. So if the IOC said, yeah, we're going to have an esports program, we're going to bring in League of Legends, and League of Legends say, well, we're not letting you play this game, or we will release a modification to this game a month before the Olympic Games takes place, then it's you know, the whole world is up in arms here. So there's a real challenge over the ownership of these titles. It's different with other sports. Like, you know, nobody owns the idea of football, even if there are events that are created that are owned by organizations. Football can still take place outside of that proprietary system, but esports can't take place because they are essentially proprietary products. So it's a very different kind of financial proposition to work with an esports title, where that experience and all that goes along with it, like the nurturing of talent. So you know, something simple as the fact that, how do you imagine a young person's journey into Olympic level esports participation when, you know, they may start as a 10-year-old or 12-year-old playing a particular game, and that game may not exist by the time they're 18 years old. So what is it they're competing in? These are really sort of practical challenges with figuring out how to develop a long-term kind of career path that is internationally feasible, and where you have those sort of, you know, nationals and local and regional tournaments that allow you to then show who's the best in the world. This year, we'll see, I think, a competition take place around the Roland Garros tennis tournament, where they'll have an e-games series, which will bring the best players in their game into that world. But I think that's where it's still early days for them. I mean, I spoke to them just a couple of weeks ago, and it's clear that they don't really know what they're doing. They want to be part of esports in some way. They've got a computer game version of tennis that was really, you know, quite successful last year with the Mutua Madrid virtual tennis tournament, but it's still a niche game. It's still really only a sort of fraction of the games that we see played on the wider esports level. But I think another way to look at this, Bertrand, is actually the wider innovation community around the sports. So here's one example of that. This is some promotional material around the Intel esports masters event that took place just before the Pyeongchang Olympic Games in 2018. So the relationship broker here is Intel, which is obviously a worldwide partner for the Olympic movement. And I think potentially that's the way into establishing sports related programs, to do it through a kind of technology partner like Intel to realize those sorts of events. So perhaps not And I think this is transformative because it's then a very different kind of qualification cycle to what we typically see in the elite sports world, and the management of that would be quite different, I think, as well. But it might be that those are the ways in which esports can become part of that program, by having a completely different ecosystem around the qualification of activities. And we see organizations like Samsung innovating with immersive technologies. This is the skeleton from Winter Olympic Games. So we're beginning to see many of those technology partners create new forms of experience. And I think, to some extent, I guess I believe that it's those economic stakeholders that are nudging us increasingly towards more of those sorts of relationships. It's examples where we see existing federations work with technology partners to create versions of their sports that are completely novel. In this case, we've got the company Virtually Live working with Formula E to create a virtual reality experience of their sport. So where you can put your headset on and you can then either find yourself located in the car of the driver that you want to watch or follow, or where you can watch the race from around the track as it's taking place. These are all examples of those different integrations that create alternative spectator and audience experiences. But there are also ways that you can see how the brand of the federation can create new sort of income revenues that are built on what are effectively quite cost-effective models. So if you think about a computer game as a place to locate advertising, and you realize that hundreds of thousands of people are playing these games on a daily basis, then you've got huge amounts of exposure coming out of those advertisements. The beauty of which is now that because all these games are online, you can continuously modify the advertisement visualizations that people see within them. So Julius Bar may have been the sponsor for this particular segment, but if they wanted to change that, then that's also possible with a modification of the software. So I think these are expanding the sorts of opportunities that sports federations have to access and also augment existing markets. And Formula E has been a great example in recent years where it's tried to innovate with that audience experience. So they have had things called fan boosts where the spectators can kind of cheer for their favorite driver. Sorry, just looking for my phone here. Have you seen my phone, Ethan? Because my computer's about to die. And where they're able to then create a completely different experience for those spectators through this virtual reality headset. Can I take just a couple of minutes break because I need to find a device? Cool. Okay, crisis over. So these are, I think, all good examples of how that can be a completely different way of expanding those propositions around new sorts of experiences. It's a new sort of phenomenon that I think that the sports world is trying to actively pursue, but it's still very early for them as well. And then, as you saw as a glimpse of this earlier with Hadosport, with the idea that you can create these mixed reality arena experiences. And if you think about this is a promotional video. And obviously on television, it can work because you're seeing the visualizations. If you're in the arena, you wouldn't see these balls of light being thrown against the other person. But actually, there are now technological ways to make that possible. So you can surround the field of play with a digital mesh that allows that three-dimensional projection mapping into the space so that you can actually see this in the physical environment. Now, I mean, I know that if I was able to go and see this event with these mixed reality functions within it, then I think it'd be quite a compelling thing to go and see. And I think that's another aspect of it that we're beginning to see quite quickly emerge within this space. And it does feel, I think, for me, that sort of technologically anything is possible. It feels like we are sort of on the verge of being able to realize things in the physical and digital space that just weren't possible before. So it's also working with partners that are already within this space. This is a broadcaster using augmented reality to, again, create a more compelling data visualization of a cycling race, sort of as part of its analysis, and showing us, you know, what's happening in the field of play. And again, these are experiments, but I've seen this now being used by broadcasters in a variety of ways to show audiences what's happening in the competition as it's taking place. So we're seeing that integration take place from the broadcaster's perspective as well. And that's, again, because I think the broadcasters need to find new ways of making sure that people will actually switch on and tune in to their televisions to actually watch any content at all. So I want to sort of get to wrapping up and allow some time for more time for questions. But for me, what this means for the sports industry is a variety of things. One is that it's a complete renegotiation of their innovation culture. What were historically the stakeholders of the Olympic Games or other elite sports brands are now completely different. We see, you know, examples like Airbnb, I think, reveal to us that there's a changing landscape of economic stakeholders around elite sports, which is intimately connected to the demise of television, the expansion of gaming within society, but also the integration of active, virtual, and immersive technologies within our everyday lives. These combination of things is what's telling the story of esports and why so many people are thinking about it. But there's a huge amount of things that we still have to kind of figure out. Many of things we talked about, like trying to make sure that that the competitions have integrity, making sure that they can function in a way that's practically achievable worldwide, making sure that there's accountability, responsibility from organizations involved, making sure that we address questions of participation. I mean, this is a world that's still incredibly male dominated, especially at the competition level. It's something that the esports world is really struggling to understand and figure out as to why there are so few women competitors. And so despite all of these sort of exciting things, there's some real sort of practical, ethical challenges around elevating esports as a kind of preferred practice for our cultural pastimes. But what was really interesting also during Lausanne, we had the Olympic Games last year, there was an esports space that was set up in the city as a showcase. And it sort of, I think, began to show how the presentation of esports is also incredibly appealing from an event organizer's perspective, because it's quite affordable, comparatively speaking. And of course, you see this with gaming titles like FIFA. If you want to produce television content of sports, it's really expensive. But streaming gaming content, it doesn't cost anything at all, because the gamers are streaming the content themselves. There's no production that needs to go into that presentation. We just need to see the game. And that's one of the major, I think, advances of this. Like, I remember seeing a quote from a few weeks ago, someone saying that the sort of Netflix model of television is also on its way out, because if you want to have a new series on Netflix, you know, it can cost you around $50 to $100 million, when in fact on platforms like YouTube or Twitch, all this content is being made for free by the participants and the users. So it's a very different world. And I think that world of streaming games is the kind of bottom of the pyramid that underpins elite esports. And I think if the sports world doesn't sort of realize that, then it does sort of face a future of growing irrelevance, but also just growing obscurity, because there just won't be that same level of interest in watching those elite performers. That's not to say that sports or physical activity will become irrelevant or undesirable. And in fact, I would sort of leave you with one thought, which is that if we did in fact spend more of our time watching gamers and streamers and esports rather than sports, we may actually, I think, retreat from this idea that elite sports performances are in fact desirable goals to have. In fact, what we would want people to have is balanced lifestyles where they engage with a variety of pursuits rather than just pursue one at that elite level. And it might be that a different value system that's emerging around esports is where we see the beginnings of that disenchantment with what was essentially a sort of 20th century model of excellence that perhaps doesn't quite apply in the world today. And that's, I think, where I'll leave it. Thanks very much. So I think if there are any questions, Olan, I don't know if anyone's able to speak and turn the mics on, but by all means, feel free to open up to questions.
Yeah, you mentioned it, but do you have an idea or a rough estimation of the women participations in esports?
I don't have very many figures, I'm afraid. I know that that for all people working in the sort of event production side of esports, it's considered to be probably the biggest challenge is trying to find ways to open up esports to women competitors. One thing that's also very clear is that this is very geographically determined. So in Asia, for example, where there is a kind of broader definition of esports, which involves mobile esports as a bigger feature of their community, there's a much better picture over there. In the sort of Western world, I think to some extent we don't have quite as wide a definition. So there isn't much talk about mobile esports over in the UK, in Europe. So I think partly in order to get to, I guess, better levels of participation, we need to redraw the parameters of what we think esports are, and expand the number of titles that people feel can sort of legitimately claim to be esports. So if you go to parts of Asia, esports, women in esports is growing rapidly around mobile esports, and that's probably one of the things we can do.
I have a question, which I don't know if you can answer it because it's a bit looking into the future. But as a father yourself and seeing maybe my daughter's only 1 year, so I can't tell what she will be like with all this technology. But do you think, like, as you said, is it a desirable path to go where we are heading with esports if it's for the risk of growing a generation that will, instead of doing physical activity, turn towards something that is sitting in front of a computer? And there as well, of course, federations have to ask themselves, like, what is it that we really want to encourage? Or is it a smaller evil compared to a greater evil, meaning that if they don't do, maybe they will lose this generation in terms of consumers and participants, if we can say active or not active, depending on how you want to define activity. But do you think there is this new generation really, would they just, or is there a need to decide between esport and traditional sport, or can they go hand in hand, or where are we going?
I think
with the kids that grow into this world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think my sort of short answer is that we're already at that point where we have an unhealthy gaming world, and I think that the esports world sees itself as an antidote to that problem. And that's where the esports world is really at pains to try to express how it differentiates itself from the wider culture of gaming that exists. And I think there's a challenge with doing that, but just to sort of outline what that means. If you think about, so my son, for example, he doesn't play a lot of computer games. He would probably play a lot more if he was allowed. And I'm conscious that as he gets older, he may want to play more. But a lot of what his game playing involves is more like the esports gameplay, which involves you playing in a communal situation where you're competing with others and where there's a social kind of experience around it, which is different from just gaming on your own in isolation. So esports talk about the fact that they try to create social settings that then avoid some of those kind of addictive or disorder sort of habits that we see organizations like the World Health Organization very anxious about. And that's why it's sort of interesting. If you look at some of the esports players around the world at the moment, they're really great advocates for healthy lifestyles. In fact, last year when the games happened in Lausanne, the Swiss Esports Federation worked with a gallery in Lausanne to stage a sort of presentation of independent computer games. And I spoke to the president about this, and he said that their sort of mission is, or their motto is play better, not play longer. So they're trying to encourage people to think about how you can optimize your gameplay by limiting the amount of time that you play and thinking about a more balanced lifestyle, rather than just think, I'm going to play 12 hours without stopping my computer game. And I think that's a huge body of work to be doing, but I'm very conscious of how important it is, because we finished a project just last year which looked at the sort of digital lives of young people and how they think about sort of balancing lifestyle. And what's clear is that there's already a lot of sort of bad habits around digital experiences. And so esports is trying to champion a more balanced lifestyle around those digital worlds in which we live. So the hope is that, and I think that many people who work in this space feel that it's effective, is that in fact, if we can change the kind of negative gaming habits of a young person into positive esports habits, then we may have a healthier relationship between those two things, which includes encouraging people to realize, actually physical activity is a central part of being a good gamer. I think in the past we didn't have that. There was just simply a complete separation of those two worlds.
Okay, one amateur question then as well is, because I haven't done any esport or gaming, like I didn't even play Game Boy or anything, but what are the positive what do they say are the positive effects of doing esports? I mean, when I train for a marathon or anything like that, I know it's about being, I don't know, training your will, training your endurance, and doing this and core strength and all this. What is it with gaming? What do I train?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I would say just I'm trying to see if I'm still sharing. Am I still sharing my screen with you?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can just jump out of that and change it. So one of the things that we're seeing a lot more of is, and one of the things that we actually set up, actually I can just show you here. We set this up just last July. So we now sort of launched the world's sort of first journal on esports, where we're now sort of seeing a number of articles and essays come through about research that people have done on this. And so I would say that from the scientific community, this is all still quite emerging knowledge, and there's a lot we don't know at this stage about what people are getting out of their experiences. Some things we do know quite clearly is that there's certainly a lot in terms of decision making that people, so cognitively, there's a lot of demand from esports that people regard to be very good training for lots of different activities. So there's a real transfer of skill sets from esports into other sort of time critical decision making roles that the esports typically sort of requires. So being able to play competitively, people talk about sort of average moves per minute as a sort of indication of your capability within the game. And so we sort of have some understanding of that. So a lot of the research has been around those kind of cognitive skill sets in playing a computer game. I think there's also increasing amounts of evidence to show that participation in esports does create healthier lifestyles, which is And I actually remember this quite a few years ago now, some research from Loughborough University, which actually debunked the myth that computer game players were sort of all unhealthy and didn't play any sports. But I think with esports, increasingly, we see how those two things do go hand in hand, that in fact, whilst the anxiety of the sports world is that participation in esports would lead to, I guess, a loss of participation in traditional sports, that doesn't seem to be the case. It might be that you're not trying to pursue elite sports as a career or even trying to be an elite performer, but you're active and physically active in order to sort of service your sports needs, if that makes sense.
If I may, because I'm very interested in the development of e-cycling, and that's why I had a question about Zwift and those things. But
yes.
And Josephine, I think you mentioned earlier the new innovation manager of the UCI, which is Michael Rogers, is indeed a former Australian rider, elite rider. But he said very clearly to me, perhaps to answer, I don't know, or to open the question, but that the really the intention of UCI about investing in e-cycling was to develop the road cycling through the e-cycling. So that's really a kind of appealing product for them. I don't know if they will succeed in investing in e-cycling, but that's really to develop, because they observe kind of decrease of the practice of cycling, especially among the younger generations. And they invest now in e-cycling just to increase the practice of road cycling. So I'm not sure that the development of esports would be detrimental to the practice of traditional sports. And that's my perspective. I think where esports has been very successful is in having chosen to call it or to label it esports instead of only video games or something like that. Because if there were still video games, probably nobody would ask whether they should be added to the Olympic program.
Yes.
And what they have been very successful in is that just on the name they have chosen. But now that they are so successful, and that was a little bit my question to you, Andy, is whether the esports organizations now really, that's a little bit who needs whom.
Yes.
Because at the moment, if I take the example, probably, and you're right, and you said that the Zwift is probably not the most typical esports and probably not seen by esports athletes as an esports. But at the moment, I have the impression that the UCI needs Zwift much more than Zwift needs the UCI. And I don't know how, and that's we are at a very interesting time, I think, of the development of the esports, and especially those esports with physical activity. And I'm not sure even regarding the participants in those competitions. I published, I would be happy to circulate my paper on that, on e-cycling and how Zwift played a role during the COVID period. But we have seen that many competitors in e-races were, of course, the same of the riders of the road cycling during the COVID period. But now, and that was a little bit the conclusion of my article, but was if e-cycling will be a self-sustaining sport or a complement to traditional road cycling. But I increasingly see e-cycling as a sport in itself without really needing its old or traditional counterpart. And anyway,
that's really interesting, and I think I agree with what you've said. I think it's I've heard a lot about sort of sports trying to see how, I mean, and it makes sense, of course. What the sports world want is a relationship with the esports world, which is in the service of their brand. They want to use it as a recruitment into their traditional activity. And in fact, we've seen this work on in a slightly different way with the military. So for over 10 years now, the military have used esports as a recruitment tool. The US Army even has its own computer game that is used as a recruitment tool. So and I think we'll see a lot more of that sort of activity, especially as the simulations of these sports becomes even more effective within immersive technologies. But I think that your suggestion that in fact it's the esports world isn't chasing the sports world is really accurate. It's the sports world that feels, it's ironic because at the moment I think you could still argue that elite sports are the bigger organization as a community, sort of financially, but when you start to add into the esports ecosystem all those different entertainment industries, it then becomes far bigger than elite sports as they are today. But I think that there's a real a sort of challenge with esports. Sort of, I think a lot of people in esports don't really care about sports. They sort of find themselves in a kind of awkward situation where they can see that the sports world's getting interested, but actually there aren't many games that are really related to sports content. So there's not an obvious relationship for these organizations. And that is, and it might be that then what will happen is we'll see a range of sort of games developed that are about those sports. But if you think about Zwift, I mean, there's no game design really in it. It's basically cycling on a machine and representing the output in a graphical format within a virtual world. There's no wider kind of game design feature in it that makes it to be a kind of compelling game. And that's very different from those fantasy-based games that we talk about, like League of Legends and StarCraft or Fortnite even. So I think in order to get to a point where that relationship is sort of mutually useful, there needs to be, I think, from the sports world, a realization that they also need to evolve their product into something that's beyond their traditions. And if they don't manage to do that, then I think the esports world will say, well, actually, we don't really need you. I mean, it's a bit like what's happened with mobile fitness. If you look at mobile fitness over the last few years, you know, if you're a runner, you're not using the World Athletics running application. It doesn't exist. So there isn't actually any intellectual property that underpins our engagement with the physical activities that we do around those sort of sports that we play, that connects in at all with the sports federations. And I think that's where it's a very difficult position for the sports world to be in, because in actual fact, they've sort of spent 20 years failing to actually develop market opportunities around these digital experiences. I mean, everybody in the world who's a runner should be downloading a World Athletics application and tracking their running, but nobody is, because it doesn't exist. Everyone downloads Strava or Nike Run or whatever it might be that they have. So it's almost as if that the sports world has kind of remained quite static for far too long and hasn't really realized the sort of technology trend that's around them, that's affecting not just how people participate in sports, but what they then attribute to be the legitimate proprietors of physical activity. More people will know of Strava than will know of the ICU. And I think that's where there's a huge amount to be done from the sports federations to actually understand what their public presence is amongst their practitioners, certainly at the amateur level.
Don't you think this is also a source of potential conflict? Because, I mean, if a federation, a governing body, kind of takes possession of something that already exists, which we know they do exist. There is a gaming community, there's an esports community, and some of them make big money with it. And we all know that when it's going to be integrated into something more regularized as a federation, and then it comes to prize money
Yeah.
for world championships, or even sanctioning events, and also kind of, if you we see it with traditional events already, if they participate, if athletes participate in events that are not sanctioned by the federation, then they might be excluded from participating in world championships, just to make sure they kind of have the control of the organizers and the organization. So
Yeah.
how, maybe, don't you think it's already too late for them? I don't know. I'm just thinking of others, like it happened before with Red Bull. Red Bull
Yeah.
doesn't need the federation.
Yes. Yes.
And the athletes sometimes would rather go to a Red Bull event where they can make big money rather than training for world championships or anything where you can't make a living out of it.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot. I mean, I think that's partly why Dick Pound was so sort of clear about his message, is that, you know, the train has been moving, has left the station already, and it's just a question of how fast it's moving and whether you can jump on it still or not. I think that, and I think to some extent, what's interesting in the sort of science world, you see lots of sports scientists now turning their expertise to this new community of esports players. So there's a kind of migration almost into that world of competitors that's still quite new. I think, and it's difficult to know whether, in fact, it's sort of a question of the fact that the ways in which brands like the Olympic movement have nurtured sort of cultures of excellence through athletic abilities will still have the capacity to attract people in the years to come, and whether they will hold such performances in the same sort of esteem. I suspect they might not, and I think that might be because the belief that understanding who is the fastest person in the world, or who can jump the highest or the furthest, is not an inherent good that I think we can assume will continue for time immemorial. It's a product of a sort of late 19th century, 20th century quantified sort of value system that I think has been shown to be kind of woefully inadequate. 99% of elite athletes don't make any money and struggle to make ends meet. So there's a kind of disenchantment, I think, with elite sports that we may see kind of emerging around what's happening in the world of esports. Now, of course, you could say, well, it's true also in esports you have elite practitioners, but I think again that the idea that the value system of elite sports is the one to aspire to is, I think, a really big question for many people who work within the esports world. It's not clear that the Olympic athlete is the pinnacle of sort of human achievements, and that's where, if the sports world don't realize that actually the values that they think are unique or central to what they do, if their expectation is that these values will be shared by the next generation, I think they will be, you know, massively disappointed. We see that with sports that do sort of struggle for popularity and whose Olympic status is sort of hovering on sort of questionable, even if they've been there for decades. There's still sort of question marks over their kind of credibility in a world where young people are moving on to different sorts of activities. So I think there is a lot more, a big sense in which they are sort of missing the boat. And I remember in 2018, Google Fit, which I've used for quite a while now, in 2018, they launched a partnership with the WHO. The details of the partnership, or indeed the sort of consequence of it, is are quite obscure, to be honest. But it's that sort of partnership that I think the sports federations need to think about in order to sort of catch up. It's very hard if you're a sports federation to suddenly become a technology innovation company. You need partnerships with organizations like Intel, like Samsung, people that can bring that expertise into your world. But that's the way to think about it. The Olympic movement and the federations are not innovation companies traditionally. It's always been their stakeholders that make that possible. But now the stakeholders, they own the events. You know, I mean, I remember 2016, I think it was, Coca-Cola, a long-time Olympic sponsor, set up its own weekly esports program on YouTube. So Coca-Cola is no longer a drinks company, it's a broadcaster. and all those categories that underpin the economics of elite sports are being completely transformed by this new world of streaming and gaming content. And that's a major shakeup of that economic foundation that I think we haven't yet seen how this is going to end up, but I suspect it won't end up well for those sports unless they do make effective ways of kind of connecting their core product with these new communities of participation.